So if you know me, you know I'm not a car guy. I don't like fixing my car. I don't like working on my car. Some people here know that intimately well. Uh, I don't like when my car has problems. I like when my car is nice and clean and shiny on the outside and runs well with no issues, which means when I see one of those little lights flash on my dash, it is something that I do not enjoy. I do not like those little indicator lights that tell me that I got to get gas. Why do I got to get gas? I don't want to get gas. An engine light, an oil light, a tire light. I don't like any of those gauges. But if I ignore those gauges, those indicator lights on my dash, I am ignoring something that underneath the hood of my car could have disastrous effects. And my car will look great on the outside potentially. Say it is shiny, it is clean, it has just been washed, it has just been waxed, it looks great. And from the outside, everybody is perceiving my car just like I am. That's a nice car. Look how well it's running. But I alone on the inside of that car know every time I start it up and I see that little light, I got to take this in. Something is wrong. In a similar way, your marriage can have a really nice, shiny outside. There could be lots of things that everybody from their perception looks at and says, you know what, your marriage, you look like you guys are doing great. You're happy, you're smiling, you're here, you're in ministry, things are fine. But there are some forms of indicator lights in your marriage that might point to there being bigger systematic issues underneath the hood. One of those indicator lights in your marriage is that of what is going on with the sexual health of your relationship. What is going on? If I were to do a survey across the room and just say, where are you at in your sexual health? And you're really thinking about it, maybe everything on the outside is looking good and you're saying, you know what, our sexual relationship is not going well. We've got some major indicator flashing lights, warning, saying something's wrong here, something's wrong here, something's wrong here. And those are serving as an indication that maybe something bigger is going on in your marriage. Sex is not just some throwaway topic, something we attribute to some cultural conversation or just this small little segmented part of our marriage. No, it is a bigger indicator and picture of what is going on in the depths of your marriage. And so it becomes vital for us as Christian people, Christian couples, husbands and wives, to be able to do a good diagnostic look when we have that and to dive in and say, how are we doing on this issue? Is there anything that needs to be fixed? Is there an issue? Because you don't want your marriage to die because you've neglected this one indicator. So I want to take a look at some of those indicators tonight. And I rarely do this when I come up here and I preach, but I want to do this tonight and give you a few caveats here because of the topic that we are discussing. A few caveats here. First one is this. This can be a sensitive conversation, so first things first. In your groups, I have specifically designed your questions to be general. I do not want you nor need you to get specific and detailed. If there are things that are wrong or problematic and you do not want to share those, you do not need to share those. This is one of those areas where if you feel that this is something that is left for you and your spouse to discuss, that is where it should stay. I don't want to violate your conscience in this area. If you are someone that is more open to talking about this and don't care, who knows what's going on, be careful and use discretion because there are others that might feel that this is inappropriate. At the same time, this is something that we need to take seriously. So I have written with intention your individual questions without much of a barrier in place for you to dive in and think through, and your couple questions for you to discuss with your spouse on this subject. I desperately do not want you to get into a fight with your spouse this week over this. And as I wrote them, I could see it happening. So I tried not to write them to that end, yet I feel like it can happen. So please, this is not a tool. I'm not trying to cause division in your marriage on this subject. I'm just trying to add a layer of health to your marriage in this area that will require some conversation. So that's what we're trying to do. Last caveat is this. If there is ever a sermon topic that makes you do that L-shaped amen, where you go right past you and point your finger at your spouse, this is the topic. So it's really hard in this conversation to not immediately attribute every negative thing that might be said that's an issue in a sexual relationship with the finger pointed at your spouse. I'm going to ask you to point the finger at yourself tonight first and foremost, and to try to avoid doing that L-shaped amen where you just go, yep, that's right, I'm good, but they're not, okay? We got to try to avoid that because you need to focus on you, and then your spouse needs to focus on themselves, and then you guys can come together and work together on this. But does that work for you guys? Okay, I'm just giving you some caveats because I know the nature of this topic. So I want to dive into this, and I want to go into a passage. It's listed on your sheet. This is kind of as Pastor Mike would say, penultimate passage on this particular issue of issues in marriage. And Paul is going to address them. So I want to take us to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And I want to read this and give some comment to you as a framework that we'll go back to for this discussion. So let me read this to you and give some comment just so we can start thinking about the way that this is phrased from Paul. Now, Paul has clearly at some point written to the Corinthian church about sexual ethics, Christian sexual ethics, and what is appropriate and inappropriate for the Christian involving sex. And so he says early here, now concerning the matters about which you wrote and which he's discussed before, he's thinking, okay, there has been conversation had, you're asking me questions, I'm corresponding back with you, there's correspondence going back and forth about a Christian sexual ethic. And this general phrase that Paul's going to quote here, it says, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. So here's a general concept that's probably floating around in the early church. Sex is something that can lead to sin. We hear all the time from Jesus about sexual sin. We hear it from the apostles. We hear it in the writings of Paul himself about sexual sin and the dangers of sexual sin. And so we're given a general statement, sex must be bad, right? And so this is him dealing with this question, okay? He's gonna deal with this issue. Is it appropriate or not for a man and a woman to have sexual relations? To which then he responds to this. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, the issue of Paul here is saying, you know what? The whole argument of 1 Corinthians 7, it's probably better for you in service to the Lord to not get married. It's better for you to not have sex at all. It's better for you to be wholly given to the Lord and service to him, to not worry about the sexual issue at all. But because there is such a thing that Jesus talks about and that he talks about and the apostles talk about and that we hear about in the Old Testament, that there is this temptation to sexual immorality, that there needs to be some additional concessions that God has given in his providence that need to be explained here for those that are given to sexual desire as a fulfillment of that sexual desire within God's economy. So he says, because there is this ability to sin against God's created order in this and sin sexually, I'm going to create a boundary for this. God's going to create a boundary and he's going to clarify it. Because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband, is how it's phrased. This is a general statement about the fact that the sexual relationship is now bound up and only found in the confines of one man, one woman in a marriage covenant. That's the basic Christian principle covenant idea of marriage and sex and marriage that we all understand. That's the basic framework that he's going to give, and then he's going to now say, okay, we've got that underneath our belt. It's probably better for you not to have sex. If you have a desire to have sex, you have the temptation to sin sexually, potentially, within you, it's better for you to get married, and the only way a marriage works is between one man and one woman. Now you should get married, and you should each just correspond to one another in that relationship, and that's the only appropriate use for sex within a marriage. Now let's give some more details as he goes on. He says this, the husband should give to his wife. So he's the one in giving to his wife her conjugal rights, is the way this is phrased. So what's going on here is it's saying the wife has some rights, some things that she can require of her husband. That's the way this is phrased. The wife has some sort of expectation she can place on her husband, and the husband is to freely give of himself to meet those expectations. Now, this is in the context of sex. So what's being said here is the wife, if she has an expectation for the husband to fulfill his duty sexually to her, then the husband is required to give to his wife to fulfill that duty. That's the way that this goes. And likewise, the wife to her husband. I'm going to read it from another passage because I think this is more helpful. Not passage, but another translation of this from the CSV, because this is really what's being said in the Greek here. A husband should fulfill his marital responsibility to his wife. That's really what's going on here. So the marital responsibility is to give of himself to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Okay? This is about duty and responsibility within the context that's clearly stated of a Christian sexual ethic. And then with more detail, says, okay, if that's not enough for you, it's not enough for you to understand that the way that this works is you have to freely give that which is your wife's duty to take from your husband, and your husband's duty to take from his wife, this conjugal right, this sexual relationship. We have more detail. For the wife does not have authority over her own body. Okay? It's authority language. There is a transfer of ownership is really what's going on here. Authority, control in some sense. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Now we've transitioned. Okay, you think you have autonomy, authority, you control your own body. In the marriage relationship, once you have gone into this, now you've relinquished that authority over to another person, and they have that over you. And then he says, not so it's one-sided here, because we know that there's an authority structure within the home where the husband is head over the wife and the wife submits to the husband. That doesn't happen in this context where it's just the wife is to give herself to the husband. No, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body. He is still head. She's still to submit to him and his leadership. But in this context, in the sexual ethic, the way the sexual relationship works between a husband and wife, there's no difference. Total equality here. The husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife does. Meaning that the husband has the ability to request and participate in sexual activity with his wife when he sees fit, and the wife has the ability to ask for, request, and participate in sexual activity when she wants, because they have the authority of the other person's body. Another way of looking at it is this, that when you have authority over your own body and you have a sexual desire, you have the ability to decide where to have an outlet for that desire. Once you get married, you no longer have that authority. That authority is taken from you and is given to your spouse. They have that ability to put confines around where you have your sexual needs met. It's only found within your spouse, and it goes between husband and wife. You relinquish your authority over what you're going to do with your body, and now your spouse owns that authority of what they're going to do. Then, to be even more clear, he says, given those realities, you could imagine that there's problems that occur, right? So he says this, given all that husband really doesn't have authority over his own body, his wife doesn't have authority over her own body, and you are to give yourself each other's rights to fulfill your duty and responsibility sexually to each other. He says, do not deprive one another. Some translations even put the word do not sexually deprive one another, because it's so clearly that's what this is talking about. This is not an emotional thing. This is a sexual ethic that's being taught here about a husband and wife. Do not deprive one another, okay? This is an imperative. This is a command. This is Paul speaking to the church and saying, church, listen to me. This is a command that I'm giving to you. If you are married, you cannot deprive one another sexually. If you do so, this is wrong according to God's framework of what he did in forming the marriage and causing a husband and wife to be one flesh with one another, giving of themselves and the transitioning of the authority from one to the other. That would be sinful of you to do it. Then he says, but there's a caveat. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps. It's even like this idea, it's like a double. Except maybe, perhaps, in this one particular case, then another one, by agreement, right, with one another for a limited time. Like, how many caveats does he have to make? The idea of the thrust of this argument is do not deprive one another of sex with one another. You should not do it. But there is an occasion where, and there's times, there's a reasonable period of time where you don't do this, and it should be for a limited time, which puts some boundaries on it. It shouldn't be a long time that you deprive one another. There should be no depriving one another. If there is this exception, short period of time, and you do it by agreement, and in this exception. So what is it? That you may devote yourselves to prayer. Because the whole point of 1 Corinthians 7 is saying, really what he's trying to secure is undivided devotion to the Lord, is what he's saying. So even within your marriage, this is something that you should engage in. And the only time where this should be something that stops in your marriage is for you to do the more important thing, which is to secure undivided devotion to the Lord. But you still need to come back together again when it's over, because you can't get rid of this. And then it says more clearly, so that Satan cannot tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Which is interesting, because we often think that the unmarried are the ones that lack self-control sexually. But I actually think, and I think Paul is making the case here, that it's the married people that, because they have the regular outlet for their sexual desires to be satisfied, that they don't have the same level of self-control with their sexual desires, because they continually have a means of satisfying those desires. And it's supposed to be within the boundaries of marriage. And so what Paul is essentially saying here is, oh, you need to be really careful, Christian, if you are doing this wrong. If you're thinking about sex wrong and you are confining it to something that it shouldn't be confined to, and you're going to the point where you're saying it's bad or it's wrong or it's not important, it could be problematic to you, because what you could be doing, whether intentionally or unintentionally, is causing your spouse to sin by pushing them to seek to fulfill their sexual desire in someone else, when the whole reason they got married, according to Paul's logic here, is so that they have a partner underneath God's economy to have a fulfillment of the sexual desire. So this would be bad if you did this. Okay. I want to give you a little diagnostic categories, 5 categories that I think this passage speaks to, and others, about where you can identify your marriage in terms of the sexual relationship within your marriage. So let me give you 5 types of sexual relationships in marriage. And the first one taken from this passage is very clear. This would be the sexless marriage. This is the sexless marriage. Now, this is a bad one. This should not exist. I'll just say it that way. This is something, according to the verse that we just read, very clearly, that there should be an ongoing, if there is ever a break, limited time in the break, so an ongoing sexual relationship, which means that every marriage that is committed to one another underneath Christ should be engaging on a regular basis in the sexual part of their relationship. It would be bad if anybody in this room is saying, I do not have sex with my spouse. Now, I will throw one caveat on there. There are some circumstances, of course, that make this impossible. I understand those. That's not what I'm saying. But if there is not something that is barring you from doing this, and I don't mean some emotional reason or relationship reason, but some physiological reason from barring you from doing this, this is a wrong approach. I mean, it cannot be more clear from this text. It would be wrong for you to not have sex with your spouse. And you might not think of it as, we're not depriving one another. You might be thinking, we mutually agree to deprive one another or to not have sex. But I don't think that fits within the framework of how this works. Because even Paul, he's not just saying don't deprive one another. He's saying you need to come back together again. Because there is a temptation that you have to sexual immorality that is only supposed to be dealt with in this way. And you can give as many caveats as you want and say, I'm not tempted to sexual immorality. And I'd say, you need to be careful if you start to throw up any justifications to work against this verse and say, you know, we've mutually agreed to deprive one another and not have sex with each other at this point in our marriage. Every single person in this room should make sure that you're not in a sexless marriage. And if this is where you are, if this is the place where you are right now in a sexless marriage, this needs to change. And if you need help, you need to get help, because you cannot be here. You cannot live here. You can't remain here. You need help to get out of this. This is not good for your marriage. Okay. I think we know that. We know that's not good. So let me give you one more here. The next one is this. It's kind of the opposite of the sexless marriage. It is the marriage that is overly focused to the point where the real core of the marriage is sex. That everything it revolves in the marriage about how much we have sex. The health of our marriage is 100% determined on how much we have sex, how good the sex is, what our sex life is like. This is also a very, very bad course of action. It's immature, it's quite foolish, and we know that this is not the center or the core of our relationship. If at any point your marriage starts to shift into this thing where you're saying, you know what, this is what it's all about. This is what we talk about. This is the true marker of everything in our relationship is just sex, and this is what we're gonna make trips to go on just so we can have tons of time to have sex, and we're gonna ship the kids off as often as we can. This is it. This is it. I think we're missing the point here. Sex is a component part of a healthy relationship. It is not the whole relationship. It is not the most important part of the relationship. It is a component part that should exist and should be functioning healthily. But it should not be the core, the center, or the absolute object of focus. To prove this, even from this text, think about what Paul is saying here. If it was the center, if it was the most important thing, he wouldn't give an exception to it. He'd say, don't deprive yourselves under any exception. But he says, no, there are exceptions, and here's one real clear exception. A clear exception is the Lord and seeking his kingdom and his purposes and going to him in prayer and seeking his will in your life and seeking to please him. That's way more important. That's the whole point of 1 Corinthians 7. So there's always things in our marriages where we would say, yes, sex is going to fall underneath my service and care for people here. It's my time and my devotion to the Lord. It's not prioritized, or sex is not prioritized over my devotion to the Lord. That's got to be clear. So this is what a lot of young people struggle with. I'm not sure how many people here are obsessed with sex in their marriage, but this is an immature response that we have to make sure that we're not falling into. Our relationship with the Lord and the things that the Lord asks us to do has to take priority even over this, okay? But this next one could be a logical response from this. Say you're having sex maybe regularly, you're not obsessed, it's not the core center of your life, but maybe this is the category that you fall into. You fall into the malnourished category of your sexual relationship. What do I mean by that? I mean that you are having sex, but at one or maybe both of you, you are not having enough sex with each other. One of you is really hungry and the other one might be fine. Maybe both of you are very hungry, okay? And let me just throw up this verse here again so you can just look at how this is phrased. You're not to deprive one another except perhaps by agreement, okay? Think about the implications of this. This doesn't mean, well, I think that I am providing enough sexual engagement with my spouse because I'm satisfied. And they should be satisfied too. No. It's mutual agreement is what this is. By agreement with one another, with a purpose. This isn't you unilaterally deciding that your spouse is satisfied because you are satisfied. Or, other people, they have less sex than we do, so you should be fine. That's not how this works. The two people deciding how this works are you and your spouse. And you and your spouse need to come to an agreement of whether you're not going to have sex and presuppose that you are, that there's not going to be any depriving unless it is agreed upon by each other. That's the idea here. And so it's very easy to get caught in this trap of comparison. Of saying, well, I've talked to this friend over here, I've had this conversation with some of my group, or I know how people are in the world, or I hear people talk about it, and they have a lot less sex than we do, or we should be fine, or what, we have tons of sex, and you might have a spouse. This doesn't have to be just a husband. This could be a wife too that is sitting there and saying, it's not enough. We are not fulfilling our desire here. I'm still hungry. Okay. If you find yourself in this category, this is not a good category. You need to get back in alignment with the principles of this text and say, you don't need to deprive one another. You're going to come back together. That's the idea. And if you ever have a time where you're going to not be together, it's by mutual agreement, common agreement for a limited time, so that you make sure that the person that you're committed to sexually is fulfilled sexually so they are not tempted. So they are not tempted. Always keep that in mind. Okay. Now, the fourth one is the one that I'm going to vamp on a little bit here, and it might be a little confusing to hear at first, but you might find yourself in what I would call the sexually defective marriage. Okay, what do I mean by this? What do I mean by this? I mean, you might find yourself not fitting into any of those previous three categories. You might say, you know what? As far as I can tell, if I'm going to evaluate my marriage between me and my spouse, we're going to sit down, we're going to say, we have sex, we're not obsessed with it, and you know what? We're both seem like we're having enough. Like we're not, no one's begging, no one's malnourished, no one's starving to death. We're fine. Everything's fine. And yet, there's something about your sexual engagement that is unfulfilling. It's not accomplishing what the sexual component of your relationship should accomplish, maybe is the way I would say it. That there's something that's defective. Though you are having sex, something's wrong in the engagement. It's not satisfying you in the way that it's supposed to. Now, when I say supposed to, I have to give another caveat here and say, I don't mean that if you're watching pornography and have built up sexual fetishes in your heart and you have extreme desires that are unrealistic, that you should have your sexual desires met. I mean that God has intended sex to do something, not just to be some symbolic act, but to actually accomplish something within the marriage, to bring a connection between you and your spouse through the sexual relationship that can't really be done any other way. And if that connection is not there, then you're probably having a defective part of your sexual relationship. So let me take you to Matthew 19 here for a second, just to draw out this principle from this component. Of course, this is a quote from Genesis, Jesus reaffirming this sexual ethic of what is going on here and the way that God has made husband and wife, male and female, to be one flesh. He just says, of course, therefore a man shall not leave his father and his mother, but shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. And the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Now, when we hear that, there is an implication here that we should always read in, that there's some sexual component that's being said here. This is not just some mystical union where two become one. It has a real world component to it as well. And the whole idea of there being a one flesh reality between you and your spouse is really at the core of what's going on if the way you think about sex in your relationship. And if you get this wrong, you can have a defective sexual relationship. Because maybe you are just thinking that sex is a physical act. And you're thinking, this is a purely physical thing. It is to fulfill a desire, to satisfy an urge, to provide a release, and that's it. If that's the way you think, you're wrong. That's not the way the Bible talks about it. This is a kind of the pinnacle consummation of the two people becoming one flesh. And it's supposed to symbolize that, and you're supposed to feel that they're supposed to be like, yes, we are together. It's the physical expression of your one flesh union. That's what this is. So we just did communion this last week, Lord's Supper. And like in the Lord's Supper, what we do is we take something physical and we participate in ingesting something physical, which is symbolic of a reality. But we're doing a physical act, and we're called to do the physical act on a regular basis when you meet together as something that you're doing to symbolize what God has done in bringing union between you and in Christ. That's what's going on here. And you're not to neglect this. You're to do it. You're to be thoughtful about it. And as you do it, there's supposed to be a reflective reality that's taking place that says, I am one with Christ, made clean and washed by his blood and his broken body, forgiven, expunged, clean. And that's that experience you're supposed to have when you take the cup and you take the bread. In a similar way, it's different, but it's similar. When you are a married person, and God has designed this in such a way that it should be obvious, your corresponding anatomical parts make you one flesh. I mean, you fill in the other in such a way that fills the person up. It is, you're coming together in such a way that symbolizes you are one. It's something that God does in the marriage covenant that you can't see. Something that you're saying, I'm still a person, they're still a person, but God says, no, you're one person. You're one flesh. No longer two, you're one. That's how this works. But there's also supposed to be the sense that you experience that. We are one flesh. We are vulnerable before one another. Even the fact that sex has to be something that is naked between two people, the most vulnerable you can get, it implies that there has to be a level of trust, of handing over yourself to the other in the most vulnerable way, entrusting yourselves to them. And you only would do that to someone that you trust to the point where you trust them like your own flesh, because you are. In the same way we submit to Christ, totally, openly, full obedience, whatever you ask us to do, that's what we're gonna do. That's what's going on. We symbolize that in communion. We recognize it and we say, yes, I'm washed clean by the blood of Christ, and now I feel it. I'm committed. I will do what you want me to do. The sexual relationship should have some component when you are having sex with your spouse where you have a deeper connection with the person. You feel the union, and it's there. And I think a lot of people can check all the boxes and say, we're having sex, we're having it enough, I'm not obsessed, these things are fine. But you know what? We're missing this. We're missing this part. We have a defective sexual relationship to some degree. This requires that you let your walls down. You entrust your spouse in the sexual encounter to the point where you are saying, I am freely giving myself to you, over to you. I'm entrusting myself to you like you have total control. That's how this is supposed to work. Giving yourself freely, openly to one another. That's how it's supposed to work. If you move past this category and you can figure out how this works, the chances are that you will get into the category that we all want to be in, which is we want to have a healthy sexual marriage relationship. And I think just to basically define it, if we can put all these pieces together, I think I could say with confidence, you probably have a healthy sexual relationship. I cannot just say you have a healthy sexual relationship if you have sex, because you might not be having sex enough. You might be depriving one another. I cannot say you have a sexually healthy sexual relationship if I say you're having tons of sex all the time, that's all you talk about, that's all you want to do. I say that's not healthy either, because you're maybe neglecting the more important things, the priorities in your life that Paul says you should, priorities in the Lord in the first place. I can't say you have a healthy sexual relationship if one person's fine and the other person's not. One person's starving, the other person's filled up. And I can't say that you have a healthy sexual relationship unless in your engagement of your sexual relationship, there is a union that is a connection that is brought at a deeper level between the two of you that you both sense, and it fills you up at a soul level that goes beyond the physical. It goes beyond the physical. That should be happening. Maybe not every time to the full extent, to the same measure, but there should be something about it that brings you back to this union that you're one flesh. And it's a mentally engaging act. You're saying, yes, that's what we are. God has done this. It's amazing. So grateful. This is good. And we have a healthy sexual relationship. That's what we want. To get there, we need to identify some of the issues. So let me just go through these as quick as I can here. Here's some issues that might be causing some of these problems, okay? First one, I'm going to go through quick. It's the defilement issue. If you are engaged in sin sexually at all, or have brought sin into your marriage bed, this will be the number one cause of causing issues to give you an unhealthy sexual relationship in your marriage. So we know from Hebrews 13, of course, the marriage bed is to be left undefiled, which means you don't bring anything into this that is not within the confines of what God says to bring into it. Okay? A brief illustration, just because I want to try to explain this as best as I can. We know that God says, you and your spouse, that's all that's supposed to be in the bed, okay? You got the rule? There it is. There's the rule. I had a rule at a place that I worked. It was the very first place I worked. It was a dining restaurant. It's actually where my wife and I met, conference center up in Lake Arrowhead. It was a dining room, and there was this rule. It was the worst rule in the world, okay? It really was. And it was, you're not allowed to eat the food. That was the rule, okay? I worked at a dining place. They had excellent food. I wasn't allowed to eat the food. Horrible rule, okay? I like to eat. Now, I could understand the rule. There was reasons for the rule. It made sense, and that was the one rule. But what if I walked around and I started making all these concessions in my life, and I was like, you know what? I'm not going to eat the food, but I am going to taste the food. Like, I'm just going to have a little bite, maybe stick my finger in the soup, just eat a little bit of that. I'm not going to eat the food, right? I'm just tasting the food, right? I'm not going to eat the food, but you know what? I might throw a little bit in my apron pocket and save it for later. I'm not eating it. I'm not messing with it. I mean, the heart of the rule is being broken regardless. And sometimes we like to justify how this works in our sexual relationship with things like pornography and lust and doing things like fantasizing, either before, after, or during the sexual encounter, wishing that your spouse was someone other than they were or doing something other than what they're doing. You're fantasizing about a thing, a place, a person, a body part, a this or that. What we are doing is we're taking the rule of defiling the marriage bed and we're playing with it. Yeah, we've not brought anybody in physically, but you've brought them in your mind. Yeah, you've not brought anybody into your bedroom physically, but you've brought them into the secret in pornography when no one else knows, into your house when everybody else is unaware. We're playing with the rules. And if you're playing with the rules that God has set for marriage, you're in trouble. This is not the way that this works. The marriage bed is to be left undefiled. You and your spouse do what you and your spouse are going to do in your bed, and no one else comes in. That's the rule. In any way, shape, or form. That's how this works. If you have a defilement issue, you're going to have one or many of these problems that we discuss, and you're not going to have a healthy sexual relationship. First things first is to get this stuff out. Get the sin, sexual sin, out. If you're lusting, if you're looking, if you're seeing things that you shouldn't see, get it out. It will help your marriage. There are physiological issues that can cause problems within a sexual relationship. And I do have to give two categories to this just so we're clear. I think that there are very reasonable ones, justifiable reasons that can cause some issues, and there are unreasonable ones, okay? So let me just to be clear, give you some reasonable ones. It is reasonable that your spouse, and you don't have sex if your spouse just had surgery, right? It's reasonable that if your spouse is throwing up sick, maybe that's not the best time to have sex, okay? It's reasonable if your spouse just got back from some crazy long camp retreat where they're serving with a bunch of kids and they haven't slept in 3 days and they're disgusting. Maybe they're exhausted. It's reasonable. Okay, there's a physical exhaustion that's going on. There's some reasonableness to this. Okay, we need to be careful that we don't then just throw everything into that category, because I think that is one of those areas where it's like, yes, by mutual agreement, if there's a problem, you can agree that we're not going to have sex for a time until we solve that problem. For some people, the problems don't get solved. Some people do have barriers to sexual intimacy that are physiological, that no one is trying to do, that they cannot fix by easy, basic means, and it takes medical intervention. I understand that. That is where there needs to be some clear understanding of how we respond with a passage like this. If that's the case, then we fall into this category. This is what God has handed us. We need to be content, and we need to live with our spouses in an understanding way. What are we supposed to do? This is what God has given us. If your spouse becomes a paraplegic overnight, what are you going to do? You're going to live with your spouse in an understanding way, knowing that now you have a difficult road ahead of you because there is a physiological barrier to you having sex in the way that is supposed to be the right way. But what is dangerous at times is when you take that physiological thing and you start to throw everything into that category. And you start saying, I'm tired, as a general statement, saying, your tiredness is not a mutual agreed excuse and a physiological problem that makes it so that you are going to deprive your spouse. That's not how this works. If you can get over the barrier, whatever the physiological barrier is, by like slapping yourself in the face once or twice, or getting up or taking a shower or doing something, it's not a barrier. It's not a physiological problem, and you are actively depriving your spouse because you just don't want to. Let's just be clear and call it what it is. You just don't want to. You don't want to. But it's not a physiological issue that's barring you. Something like this could be said too. Well, my sex drive is low. Like, I just don't have the desire like I used to. Well, okay. That's not a good enough excuse. You can't just throw that out and say, well, I have a low sex drive, my spouse has a low sex drive, and so we just mutually agree just not to have sex anymore. Well, you need to come to a mutual agreement based off both of your needs and appetites to make sure you're not malnourishing one another sexually, you're not depriving one another, you don't have a sexless marriage, and you guys are okay. You can come to that mutual agreement. It doesn't have to be 4 times a week, you know. You can come up with something, but you need to make sure that you're not throwing things into this physiological category that don't go into the category. So there are some reasonable physiological issues, and there are some unreasonable ones. Be careful with what you throw in that category. Now, here's the last 2 are the big ones that, to me and my pastoral ministry experience, are the core of what causes these issues. Okay? Relational issues. Some of the biggest reasons why sexual relationships are not healthy is because you have a relational issue with your spouse. What it really comes down to at the end of the day is not that you don't have a good sex drive or your desire is low, it's that you have a problem with your spouse. You are not connected, so you don't want to do the act that God made to symbolize that deep one flesh connection. You don't want to have that connection because you don't feel connected, because there's a problem in your relationship. You're harboring resentment. You are bitter. You haven't talked to them in 3 days. You don't feel like there's any connection at all between you. There is some sort of issue. You're going to say, I don't trust my spouse right now. I don't love my spouse. And because of that, I am going to I'm going to disobey Paul, and I'm going to deprive my spouse because I don't feel like it, because I don't feel connected. This is at the core of so many sexual issues within Christian circles. Well, what's really going on is that both people are hungry for a sexual relationship with their spouse, but because there is some sort of relational barrier between you and your spouse, you don't have sex because you don't really want to, because you don't feel connected to your spouse. You don't feel like you're living up to your commitments and your vows to love and cherish and care for one another. And because you're not living up to those commitments, you don't want to live up to the commitment to consummate that one flesh union in the way that you should. And so you just neglect it. Any unresolved issues with your spouse, any lack of real relational intimacy can lead to sexual intimacy problems. And like I said, it becomes a diagnostic, a tool. Your sexual relationship, how is your relationship actually doing? Because if you're having sex with one another, you're probably doing okay relationally. If you're fulfilled by one another sexually, you feel connected, you're probably doing okay relationally. But you could go back the other way and say, you know what, maybe we aren't as close as we think we are. Maybe we aren't as tight as we think we are. Maybe we are, in the truest sense, ships passing in the night. We don't even talk to each other during the day. And then we get into bed together, we sleep in the same bed, and you want to have sex with me, and I don't even want to touch you because we don't talk to each other. We don't know each other. You don't know me. How do you love me? Do you even know what's going on? That ends up being the biggest barrier and issues that affect sex and marriage. One of the biggest. And if you think about this, it's quite silly. For most of us, this can be solved by planning a date night. It can be solved by a 15-minute phone call. It can be solved by a heartfelt conversation on the way to church. It can be solved by a simple apology. How are you doing? Let's hold hands, an unexpected kiss. Let's build the connection back. It doesn't take forever, especially if you've been married for any length of time. You can build the connection back quickly and solve this problem. And if you're sitting here saying, like, we just need to have more sex, it's a command, we're supposed to have sex, we're not to deprive one another, you are supposed to have sex with me, I want to have sex with you, do the thing. Maybe you need to look at this and say, you do the thing. Point the finger at yourself. When's the last time you asked your spouse what's going on? When's the last time you felt connected to your spouse? If you haven't done that first, then don't do the next thing and point the finger and say you fulfill your biblical command. I think this passage summarizes to some degree what is going on with this relational issue. The way that we're supposed to be related to one another as a husband and a wife, according to Ephesians 5, is when we are one flesh, we're to care for the other person too. No one ever hated their own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it. If you want to have a good relationship with your own flesh, you take care of it, right? And it's total, it's whole. And that's this idea. So you're to hold fast to your wife is what's going on here. It's a deep relational commitment. And that leads to a deep one flesh realization, which leads to a desire to have the deep one flesh symbolic act that proves that you're one flesh. The consummated act of being one flesh leads to it. It's how it all works. And last, but definitely not least, and I didn't want to say psychological, so I came up with a word that I don't ever use, rationale, okay? Maybe you have a rationale issue. Maybe you have constructed a series of reasons for why this doesn't work, why you don't have sex. Maybe it's a thinking problem in some way, and this is what is going on. You've got a set of reasons that justify the issues that you have, that go something like this. You say, you know what? I've got a justifiable set of reasons in my own mind why I don't engage in sex and why I don't prioritize it. And it goes something like this. I don't have time for sex. And you say, see, I've got a rationale issue. I know if you knew how much I had going on, you would know I don't have time. Okay? I don't have the energy. I'm getting old. I'm tired. I've got a lot going on. I don't got the energy. Okay? Those are excuses. I don't know if they're justifications to avoid the way that God designed your marriage. Maybe you've justified it by saying, you know what, sex isn't really that important. Maybe you're just saying, you know what, sex isn't necessary for a good marriage relationship. And I'm saying, well, we're just going to take these passages and just throw them out and say, well, we're just going to take God's design for how this works and say, you know what, God, I think I know better than you. I'm going to have a great marriage with zero sex because I've seen other people that do it. And like you said, there's paraplegics that are married and have a great marriage. Okay, but God's design is intended a certain way. And so you want to be as close to God's design as you can be, barring unavoidable circumstances. I can't tell you the thing that drives me the most crazy when it comes to this particular issue here is when I hear either subtly or overtly this idea that sex is just a box you have to check. Or it's just this physical thing, like I've already mentioned. It's just this physical thing. Sex is the physical part of our relationship. It's just this physical thing. Why are you so physical? Why is the physical part so important to you? Don't you care about my soul, who I am, who I am as a person? Why do we have to do this? Okay, let's do it. Let's get it over with. Let's check the physical box so that we can move on. If that's the case, you've built a framework of sex in your mind that's wrong. It's not what it is. You've agreed with the culture is what you've done. You've become worldly in your thinking that says that sex is just a physical act. That's what the world says. I could prove it to you over and over and over again. Doesn't matter how many people you sleep with, it's just a sexual act. It doesn't matter if you sleep around with different people, even when you're dating someone else or married to someone else, because it's just a physical act. You have a physical urge and a need. You need to fulfill that need, and so therefore fulfill it. That's what the world says. We cannot think like that. We cannot think like the world. We have to realize that God's design for the sexual relationship is intended for much, much more than that. And we get ourselves into big problems when we start to, in our mind, make this argument, this framework argument. It's just physical. It's just sex. It's just a thing we have to do to satisfy a need or an urge or a desire that I have. If you put it into that category, you're essentially throwing even what Jesus affirms in the Genesis statement about this one flesh idea of husband and wife and how God designed sex as the consummation and culmination of that one flesh engagement. You're not getting it. We need to use these to be a diagnostic in our own lives, to be able to look through this and say, you know what? Do I have wrong thinking about this? Am I thinking wrongly? Am I building a case that's not according to Scripture? Is there a problem between my spouse and I? Is there some sort of physical thing that I'm attributing this to, or is there a real physical thing that's barring us from the sexual relationship? Or is there sin in my life, sexually speaking, that is barring us from having an intimate sexual relationship? If you can be honest with yourself this week, and your questions say, where are we at as a couple? It's not doom and gloom. I'm sure things are okay for most people. Maybe for some, it's not good at all. But we need to see sex holistically and say, you know what? God has designed this for good. He's designed it for good, to bar us from the temptation that we all feel sexually, that we've seen people succumb to and fall to. This is good. Hey, he's made a design for it, and he says, walk in it according to my plan, and we need to take him at his word and walk at it according to his plan. So, as you go to groups, as you head off, let's be careful. Let's use discernment. But let's try to align ourselves as best as we can with God's word in this area. And let's see those marked improvements in our marriage relationships in this one area as best as we can, even this week, so that we can honor the Lord with our lives. All right, let's pray. God, help us in this area. Help us to not think thoughts after the world, but think thoughts after you, as you've so clearly defined them in Scripture. God, thank you that you have instituted marriage as a good gift. As you've said in your word, it is not good for man to be alone, that a man that finds a good wife, it's an excellent thing. It's pleasing, it's a blessing, there is benefit to it, and we know that that is not just relegated to the relational aspect, but even this aspect of our sexual relationship. So God, help us to be holy in this area, to follow after your word, to bring no defilement into our marriage bed, and to see it in the way that you see it. God, help those that are struggling in this room, that have issues in their sexual relationship, to overcome those issues by the power of your Spirit and through your grace. And God, we ask that you would make us all conform to the image of your Son, even in this area, God, that we'd be in alignment with your will and with your word. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.